Good afternoon, my name is Seth Chrisman. I chose to research St. Paul from MAB because of my grandfather Paul Fox, who is named after him. I didn't know anything about St. Paul before this research in this class. This is a quote I found from St. Paul that emphasizes St. Paul's belief about the Christian religion. Whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. This means that the more you give to mankind and God, the more you receive on Judgment Day. When I first started my research, I didn't know anything about St. Paul, so I started researching his life in chronological order, starting with when he saw the light and talked to God on the way to Damascus. In 36 AD, Paul converted to Christianity. Before this, he was a Christian slayer. From 36 to 53 AD, Paul made 2 missionary trips. He used these trips to teach and preach about the Gospels and instructed by God. During this time, Paul wrote 1 and 2 Thessalonians. These were some of the letters he wrote to individual churches to help answer his questions they had about the gospel. During 54 to 58 AD, he made a 3rd missionary trip, during which he wrote his letters to the Galatians and the Romans. After the trip, he returned to Jerusalem. During 59 to 67 AD, he visited Rome, where he was first imprisoned, then set free, and imprisoned again, and then executed. Also during this time, he wrote the Philippians, the Ephesians, the Colossians, and the Philemon, 1 and 2, Timothy, and Titus. He preached mainly to Gentiles, since there was a conflict between the Gentiles and Jews. He was beheaded by order of Nero in 67 AD. My first article was by David E. Brians. This article described what Paul thought about the relationship between God and the apostles and the relationship between the apostles themselves. He introduced the concept about the vertical and horizontal proclamations. Vertical proclamations are shared between the apostles and God. Horizontal proclamations are shared between the apostles and the disciples. You should be praying to God while praying with your disciples while using both the horizontal and vertical proclamations. Paul believed that the Corinthians practiced a religious culture that benefited them and not their belief in God and their teaching of God. They boasted upon what they had accomplished in their lives instead of boasting God for what he had accomplished. Paul taught them that you should only boast in the Lord. He also promised them 3 gifts from God: to be spiritually enriched in speech and acknowledgement, to receive revelation, 3, to receive the acknowledgement that God will confirm that they will be saved. He taught God's mission, which was to give salvation while saving the people from sin. My second source was a chapter out of the book by Constantine R. Chappell. This article talks about the letters by Paul and the era who wrote them in. Campbell stressed that the plot is more important than the timeline, which means what was happening during the time was more important than the actual year it happened. Also, he stressed that in order to understand what Paul was really writing about, you need to understand the era and audience from whom he was writing. Campbell described the issues Paul had between the resurrection of Jesus and his return 3 years later. He also discussed the age versus realm. Age is a time period, whereas realm is the influences of the time period. Paul had to deal with the 2 realms. He had taught the people to believe in the future as well as in their present time. Paul stated that believers would be with Jesus at the second coming as long as they had practiced their religion and stayed true to God. He believed that in God's judgment day because he believed in the actuality of the judgment makes the world a better place leading up to the day. My third source was an article by John L. Colson. This article is about Paul's Christology and what he says about God's Spirit in Jesus' early life. Colson talked about the Spirit Christology, which also means that Jesus is to be understood in his relation to God's Spirit instead of just being God's Son. Colson believes that Jesus' resurrection on earth ended his life, and it also opened up his entrance into heaven. He suggests that Christ is related to God and the Spirit. However, Paul only talks about the Spirit when he talks about the resurrection of Jesus. Therefore, the Holy Spirit was never a part of Paul's letters. Colson also does a good job of explaining the Trinity in this article. My fourth source I read was by Ruth Rendell. Her book was a great introduction that described how Paul's preaching and teachings give a life-changing experiences to people today. Rendell stated that the road to Damascus is a phrase that has become a metaphor for the life-changing experience. She compares this change to the change in Paul before and after he saw the light and talked to God. She compared his religious beliefs to the guard in the concentration camp. Paul's conversation would be similar to the guard showing compassion and empathy to a prisoner before sending him to a gas chamber. Rendell described Paul as a holy man and as a human being at the same time. Rendell also described Paul's attempt to teach the Gospels to the Jews in Rome. She described how righteousness did not give humans the right to sin. She also wrote how Paul worked hard to teach the Gentiles and Jews how to love their neighbor because this would lead to a better judgment day. The remainder of the book was solely about Paul's letter to the Romans. My next source that I read was by E. Randolph Richards, David B. Capes, and Rodney Reeves. This source talked a lot about the time period and the audience to which Paul was writing. The author described the importance of knowing these two in order to understand the quality of Paul's letters. Paul wrote these letters individually for churches as answers to the questions they had about the situations or practices within the Christian religion. He answered their questions in letters that would allow each church to continue to teach the gospel. The authors also wrote about the hostilities that existed between the Jews and the Gentiles at the time. Paul became an apostle to the Gentiles, although he tried several times to preach to the Jews. The authors also described how the Jews and Gentiles were different in their Christian beliefs, yet shared the same culture and traditions. The sixth source that I read was a book by Thomas Chenier. Chenier talks about Paul's sufferings during his ministry and how severe it was at times. He stated that many people believed that the apostles should have held a higher level in society, but Paul didn't believe that. Paul described that the Thessalonians imitated his suffering while rejoicing in the Holy Spirit. He argued that his suffering justified his teaching because it showed he was empowered by Jesus. Some people didn't believe in Paul's teachings. Instead, they believed in Apollo or Peter. This is when Paul primarily began to teach to the Gentiles. Paul truly believed that his sufferings were a means of the salvation and that they had copied the suffering Jesus endured. Most of Paul seemed more human in this book, though. He had friends, he had made mistakes, he also had enemies, but lastly, he was a great teacher of the gospel. The next source I read was by Dixon Slingerland. Slingerland described how questionable dates about the chronology of Paul's life and ministry. This is where I actually started my research because I felt I needed to understand more of the history in order to understand his missions. Acts of the Apostles, which is considered a gospel, appears to have been written more for the political and social information as opposed to historical. Once I was able to understand the chronological order better, I was able to understand Paul's letters and life better. Lastly, my final source is by Alexander Wedderburn. The author's goal was to describe Paul's life and his lifestyle to see how they affected the way he preached the gospel. He stressed the importance of reading Paul's letters while keeping in mind the era, the setting, and the audience. Paul chose the elders in churches to serve as leaders, and then only acted a pastoral role to his churches by writing letters to answer their questions to help solve their problems at the church. His letters were personal to each church. Paul also stated that God ordered him to preach to the gospel that was taught to him by Jesus. Paul was the only apostle who was specifically directed to teach the gospels to the Gentiles. He stated that the circumcision is not necessary to be a participant in the second coming, and that the pillar apostles Peter, John, Mark agreed with Paul's teachings.